Proverbs 1:31. This is going to be a little longer than the other two. It says, "Therefore shall they eat of the fruit of their own way and be filled with their own devices." I actually have enough verses written in the side margin there next to this verse to have a full hour-long sermon just from all the verses I've written down there. There's, I was going to say a million, dozens of examples in the Bible of this very thing, but I'm not going to cover all of them tonight. So first we see there in the previous verses that we looked at, 30, 29, and 30, that God pronounced the judgment upon the people who had rejected his word and despised his reproof. And now he goes on to explain how and by what means the judgment will be executed. And that is by letting fools suffer under the weight of their own foolish decisions. So he first of all told them that it was going to happen and why it was going to happen, because they hated knowledge and didn't choose the fear of the Lord. They despised his counsel and his reproof. And now he goes on to show the method he's going to use. And it's quite an effective method, because he basically takes the foolish decisions and he just says, okay, have it your way. And you are going to suffer because of your own decisions. That's what happens here. And this really shouldn't come as any great surprise to us, because this is the way the world works. There are certain immutable laws in this world, like the law of gravity or other physical laws, which they can't be broken. And if you go up against them, you are going to be punished by them. And it's not like God is just willy-nilly choosing to punish you if he feels like it or not. You are going to be punished if you break those certain laws. If a child disobeys his parents' instruction, forbidding him to touch a stove, for instance, he's going to get burned, right? He's going to suffer because of that decision, and he's going to get what he deserves. You think, well, that's mean. Well, it's just nature. It's not mean, really. Yeah, I did miss that. That was my gravity example. Thank you. Like, for instance, thanks for pointing it out. If you are swinging from some vine or some rotten rope or something like that, and that rope will not resist the force of gravity, it's going to break and you're going to get hurt. And you're going to suffer for your stupidity, right? That's just how things happen in nature. And sometimes that's the punishment that God uses. They're called natural consequences. And that's one of God's methods for punishing sinners. I'm going to give you some examples of natural consequences. I think it was last week, about some examples of things like this, and I'm going to probably just cover some of the ones that I covered there, but I'm going to give you not only the thing, but I'm going to give you what is the consequence of. So let's look at some things here, some sinful, foolish, or unwise decisions and actions. For instance, AIDS and other STDs are the judgment for sodomy, fornication, and adultery. And I believe that God has sent those diseases on this earth for that reason. I believe that. Now, who knows, maybe some of those things have been cooked up in labs too or something. People, speculate about that. But anyway, whatever, I believe that God sent them on this earth for that reason. And they seem to especially AIDS, disproportionately affect sodomites above other people. I think that is God's scourge upon those wicked people, and they're suffering for it. Cirrhosis of the liver is the judgment for alcoholism, right? Natural consequences. Poverty is the judgment for undisciplined spending and going into debt. Obesity is the judgment for gluttony and undisciplined eating. Emphysema and lung cancer are the judgment for smoking cigarettes, or I should say excessively smoking cigarettes. One cigarette once in a while is not going to hurt you, right? But when you're pounding down a couple packs a day, you're going to end up laying in a hospital bed someday gasping for breath and really miserable and saying, how have I hated instruction and despised all thy reproof? Not a good idea. Divorce is the judgment for unfaithfulness, selfishness, unkindness, and not spending enough time at home and not appreciating one's spouse. All those things can lead to divorce. And that's not saying that the wife or the husband that divorces and goes off and runs off with somebody else is right for divorcing for those reasons. But it's just saying that it happens, right? Those things do cause divorce. They are a natural consequence of those foolish actions. And those are things that all of us, we need to be careful with, right? We all need to make sure we're treating our spouses right, spending time with our spouses, and being good husbands and wives. Losing one's children is a judgment for not training them up in the way that they should go, and in other times for not giving them the time and attention that they need. Because they need discipline, but they also need time and attention too, right? It's not just, you can have all the discipline in the world, but if they don't get your time, a lot of times that's why kids rebel, because they don't have their parents, right? I mean, they might be physically present, but they don't have, they're not given any of that attention. Usually when you see kids lashing out, it's because they want attention, right? And you can get it one of two ways. You can get it if your parents are actually giving it to you, or else you can do something to get their attention, and that usually means doing something bad so that they give you the attention. And I see that every time I see a kid, hair dyed orange, big gauge things in his ears, or whatever, wearing weird gothic clothes. I mean, maybe not every time, but I would almost bet they are not getting the attention from their parents at home that they should. And I'm not saying that every kid that does that has bad parents. I'm not saying that. But I wouldn't doubt that there's some correlation there in a lot of cases, I would think. Because that's not normal to act like that. Why would you act like that if you were, right thinking? Or being fired is the judgment for being lazy, late, disrespectful, things like that on the job, right? Natural consequences. Now, there may not always be a direct cause and effect relationship between the things that I just mentioned, but oftentimes there is, and wise people will consider those things, right? Because certainly there can definitely be a tight relationship between those things, cause and effect. Making sinners eat of the fruit of their own ways and be filled with their own devices. This is, as I've said before, one of God's signature judgments. And we've looked at several verses in the Bible that showed that, about people digging a pit and falling therein and rolling a stone and it rolls upon them and so on. And I got a few more verses here for you in just a second. This is kind of like poetic justice, when you use the wickedness or the lust or the backsliding of men or nations to punish them with it. And I mean, I just think that's kind of I'm trying to think of an example like in our own lives, but I think from God's perspective, when somebody's doing something evil and then God uses that very thing that they were doing to punish them with. Yeah. And there'd probably be examples of it, smashing mailboxes out here or something, and he goes to smash the mailbox and something happens and it breaks his arm or something, something like that. And we look at that and we're like, yeah, that's awesome. I mean, that's way better than if the cop would have went and beat the guy and broke his arm. It's way better to see him break his arm doing something foolish or wicked. So that's the kind of thing that God likes to do. One of the worst forms of punishment that God can inflict upon his children is to let us have it our own way. And, we think, it says in the scripture, there is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. And sometimes God just says, okay, do what you want. C.S. Lewis had a good quote. He said, there are two kinds of people, those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, all right then, have it your way. And I think that's pretty true. Scripture's full of warnings where God uses this type of judgment. Look in Proverbs 14 and verse 14. It says, the backslider in heart shall be filled with his own ways, and a good man shall be satisfied from himself. I've seen backsliders filled with their own ways. I've seen people backslide in the church and in doctrine and then be filled with their own ways, where God says, okay, you want to despise my word, and it just starts off with this one little thing? Okay, be filled with your own ways. And then just give them over to all kinds of rank heresy. And you guys have seen that too. Look at Psalm 94 and verse 23. There are some people in life that you learn a lot of lessons from their bad decisions. Some people you can learn from their good decisions and their good way of life. But I've found that I've learned more in life from bad examples than good. There's been plenty of good examples, and I've learned a lot from people. But I think back of different people in the church over the years that I've known, and I just think of so many things I've learned from bad examples. I just hope that I'm not one of them someday. I hope somebody's saying that about me someday. But boy, like the little picture poster thing that I have up in our apartment, where it has a picture of the ship that's sunk and its nose is sticking up out of the water like it's been there for a long time, and it says that it could be that your life only stands for an example to others, or for an example for others to avoid, or something like that. Anyway, Psalm 94 and verse 23. And he shall bring upon them, speaking of the Lord, he shall bring upon them their own iniquity, and shall cut them off in their own wickedness. Yea, the Lord our God shall cut them off, and use their own iniquity to judge them. And you know, boy, if that wasn't true, we just got done talking about the nation of Israel and the destruction in 70 AD, and the majority of the people, I don't know what the exact numbers were, but a huge percentage of the people that died in Jerusalem actually died at the hands of the Jews, of the Zealots. It was so bad in the confines of that city. Before the Romans ever got in there, they had surrounded the place, and there was so much civil war and infighting going on there with the guys that were called the Zealots. They were the ones that were going to fight off Rome, and then there were people that were trying to resist that and just say, hey, this is a stupid idea. And anybody that wasn't with the Zealots were just mercilessly torturing and murdering, and it was so bad in there that, I mean, this is kind of like what the Lord's saying here. He's going to bring upon them their own iniquity and shall cut them off in their own wickedness. It was the wickedness of their own people that was causing their destruction. Look at Jeremiah 2 and verse 19. Jeremiah 2:19. Lord says, thine own wickedness shall correct thee, and thy backslidings shall reprove thee. Know therefore and see that it is an evil thing and bitter, that thou hast forsaken the Lord thy God, and that my fear is not in thee, saith the Lord of hosts. That pretty much goes right along with Proverbs chapter 1. The Lord is going to fill them with their own devices, punish them with their own wickedness, and that's exactly what he says here. And then he says that they've forsaken the Lord, and that his fear is not in them, right? They did not choose the fear of the Lord. They despised all his reproof. It's a great parallel text for that. Look at Jeremiah 6 and verse 19. Jeremiah 6:19. It says, hear, O earth, behold, I will bring evil upon this people. Even, here's the evil. So when you see that even, it's going to define whatever he just said. He's going to bring evil upon this people, even the fruit of their thoughts, because they have not hearkened unto my words, nor to my law, but rejected it. Precisely what God's talking about there in Proverbs chapter 1. He's going to bring the fruit of their own thoughts. Bring it upon them. Jeremiah 14 and verse 16. And the people to whom they prophesy shall be cast out in the streets of Jerusalem because of the famine and the sword, and they shall have none to bury them, their wives, nor their sons, nor their daughters, for I will pour their wickedness upon them. He's prophesying what's going to happen with Babylon, but the same thing happened in 70 AD too. I was just reading in Morrow's book, 70 Weeks in the Great Tribulation. I finished that up here recently. And he said that people, they were not, it was so bad when they would try to escape at night, and if they were caught, they'd be slain. And there were just dead bodies everywhere, just heaps and heaps and heaps of dead bodies, and none of them were being buried. And in that day, Solomon said that if a man had not a proper burial, it would be better for him never to have been born. Like that was a very ignominious thing to not have a proper burial. And I don't think we probably quite look at it the same way today as they did back then, but it was so important to them, even after they were dead, to have a proper burial that they didn't want to risk trying to get out of the city and flee, because if they were killed, they'd be laying there in heaps and not have that burial. That's what he said. What was that, verse 14? 16. Yeah, have none to bury him, yep. I will pour their wickedness upon them. And let me give you one more. Psalm 81 and verse 11. Psalm 81 and verse 11. The Lord says, but my people would not hearken to my voice, and Israel would none of me. So I gave them up unto their own heart's lusts, and they walked in their own counsels. Exactly what happened in Proverbs 1. They wouldn't hearken, they wouldn't listen. God says, okay, you can have it your way. Do whatever you want and suffer the consequences. Now, here's something. Oftentimes men assume that God's judgment is the precursor of it. Now, that might not have made any sense to you. I'll say it again, and it probably still won't make sense, and then I'll explain what I'm saying. Sometimes men assume that God's judgment is the precursor of it. Here's what I'm talking about. Christians often say that God will judge our nation for things such as sodomy, fornication, abortion, broken families, debt, wicked leaders, and people talk about that. If we keep this stuff up, God's going to judge this country. Hey, they keep allowing these sodomites to run around here and get married, God's going to judge this country. People keep running around with their, on their wives and keep getting divorced. We have these broken homes. God's going to judge this country, right? These women keep murdering their babies, 1 million of them a year. God's going to judge this country, right? No, you're missing the point. We keep electing these wicked leaders. God's going to judge this country. No, that is the judgment. The wicked leaders are the judgment. Abortion is the judgment. Gay marriage is the judgment. Those that were already being judged. Romans 1, 18 through 32 shows that that God gives men up to those things as a judgment for rejecting Him. That's why, and I like political philosophy, and I like libertarian philosophy, and I listen to podcasts in my spare time when I'm brushing my teeth and things like that. I know, nerd, but anyway, I like that kind of thing. And they're always, philosophizing about how we could fix this system and blah, blah, blah. And I always go back to it no matter what they say. And yeah, what they say is true. And if you did that, it'd be better and, whatever. But I always go back to the fact that the remedy is turning back to the Lord. The problem is we've turned our back on God. And the effect of that is the out-of-control spending, or the horrible government that we have, or the lack of liberty that we have, or whatever, and all the wars and all this stuff. That's the effect of turning our back on God, right? And no political solution is ever going to fix that. It's going to have to be a people that turn their hearts back to the Lord. Blessed is that nation whose God is the Lord. But if you don't have that, I have no hope whatsoever for this country unless there is a revival. Unless there's a revival. Other than that, there is no hope, I do not believe.
Pastor, when you said people, were you talking about the elect and reprobate, or just all people?
Well, it would be the elect, right? And then the elect would have an effect on the rest. Because in this country, in the early days, I highly doubt that the majority of the country were God's elect, right? Unless it was just some special time where God had a heavy concentration of elect within one country. I doubt that the majority of the country were God's elect. But you had a Christian, you had a core Christian, what's the word I'm looking for? You basically had a Christian base. You had a Christian base, foundation. And because of that, it permeated throughout the society. So when you had Baptist churches in this country believing the truth, proclaiming the truth, and living righteously, then that went through the society and it trickled down through the society. And basically it held back a lot of the natural inclinations of men, because you had enough people that were sickened and disgusted by wicked living that you just didn't do that kind of thing, or you didn't do it out in the open anyway. And that really kept a lot of things at bay. I doubt that, like I said, I don't think that there was 75% of the population were God's elect. But if 10% were, and those 10% were actually doing what God said and living what God said, and the preachers were proclaiming what God said, that had an effect on the whole society. And so it says that judgment must begin at the house of God. If judgment began at the house of God again, and God's churches were reformed, and truth was actually preached in the pulpits, it could change. Things could turn around. God could spare the nation for the sake of, not many righteous, like he would have Sodom and Gomorrah. But without that, without changes coming from the pulpit and from the pew, you're certainly not going to find it in Washington, in the House of Congress or something like that. Not going to happen. Got to start in the house of God if it's going to go to the House of Congress or the White House.
Are you talking about the real house of God, or even those professing Christian churches?
No, I'm talking about the real house of God. Yeah. And then even that would probably sway the tide to where even some of the other fake churches would be probably getting closer to the truth. And I could be anyway. Romans 1, 18 through 32. I'm not going to read this whole passage, but we've read this passage many times. But you see there that they knew God, and then they chose to reject God. They knew him from the creation. And then because of that, it says numerous times that God gave them up. Verse 24, he gave them up to uncleanness. And then in verse 26, for this cause God gave them up unto vile affections, with sodomy. And then in verse 28, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind, you see. So whenever you see fornication, sodomy, and then just all kinds of wickedness and violence and horrible sinful things in a country, it's because God gave those people over to it. He just took away the restraining hand and said, okay, that's what you want to do? Go ahead. I'm not going to hold you back anymore. And that's when things really get bad. These things are not the cause of God's judgment. They are his judgment. And men are going to reap what they sow. If you sow briars and thistles, you're going to reap briars and thistles. If a farmer's boy goes out there and doesn't listen to his dad, and he sows weeds in the field expecting to get vegetables, he's going to be sorely disappointed, right? Weeds are going to come up in the fall or in the summer. So you're going to reap what you sow. And this principle applies with God's dealings with his children. He warns them against making foolish decisions, and if they stubbornly refuse, then they're going to reap what they sow. And I think we've read those verses enough times, that be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever man soweth, that shall he reap also, in Galatians 6 and verse 7. And I got a couple other verses there, but I'm not going to read those in the interest of time. So God's going to give rebels the very thing that they so obstinately desire, against all his good counsel and judgment that he's given them. Like, for instance, what he did to Israel. Israel came out of Egypt, the Lord delivered them miraculously, and then they were hungry and he gave them manna, right? The angel's food just showed up on the ground every morning, and the perfect food from heaven. And it didn't take long and they started complaining about that. It wasn't good enough. All we have is this white bread, this manna, and they wanted flesh. We miss Egypt. We had flesh, we had lentils, we had onions, leeks, and garlics. We had all this great stuff, and now we're out here in the wilderness. We just wish we were back in Egypt. And God says, oh, you want flesh? I'll give you flesh. I'll give you so much flesh, it's going to come out of your nostrils. And that's what he said in Numbers 11 and verse 18 through 20. Numbers 11, 18 through 20. I know of a boy that he had a friend that made himself a pipe, and he wanted to smoke some tobacco. And this boy decided, and his friend, that they also wanted to smoke some tobacco, and they went, and instead of spending the time to make a nice pipe, they just took some kind of a 2x4 or something, bored a couple holes in it, filled it full of tobacco, and the boy's dad let him do it. And he smoked tobacco, and he turned green and puked all over the place. And it was probably the smartest thing his dad could have ever done, because he's probably never gonna smoke again after that. So anyway, sometimes it's a good idea just to do what God says. Oh, you want to smoke, huh? Go ahead. Go ahead. And hopefully you'll get sick and throw up and not try it again. Numbers 11, 18 through 20. No, that's not the verse. Let's see. Numbers 11. 18. Yeah, here we go. Numbers 11, 18 through 20. And say thou unto the people, the Lord's telling Moses what to tell them, sanctify yourselves against tomorrow, and ye shall eat flesh, for ye have wept in the ears of the Lord, saying, who shall give us flesh to eat? For it was well with us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you flesh, and ye shall eat. Ye shall not eat 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, nor 10 days, nor 20 days, but even a whole month, until it come out at your nostrils, and it be loathsome unto you, because that ye have despised the Lord which is among you, and have wept before him, saying, why came we forth out of Egypt? Does you want it? Every day for a month, you're going to eat that stuff until you hate it. And not only did they eat it until they hated it, but the Lord also sent leanness unto their souls. Look at Psalm 106, 14 through 15. Psalm 106, 14 through 15. But lusted exceedingly in the wilderness, and tempted God in the desert, and he gave them their request, but sent leanness into their soul. It wasn't only a bodily judgment, into their soul. And then Psalm 78, 29 through 31. So they did eat, and were well filled, for he gave them their own desire. They were not estranged from their lust, but while their meat was yet in their mouths, the wrath of God came upon them, and slew the fattest of them, and smote down the chosen men of Israel. So he killed some of them, and he sent leanness into the souls of the rest of them. Now, sometimes God will take a more active role in judging sinners for their foolishness, and he'll send them a strong delusion so that they should believe a lie. Let me read you a verse here. This one ought to put the fear of God in you. Isaiah 66, verse 4. So sometimes God just backs away and says, okay, have it your way. But sometimes he says, you know what? You've irritated me enough. You don't want to believe my word? I'm going to send you a delusion, and you're going to believe a lie. Psalm 66 and verse... Why did I say Psalm 66? Isaiah 66 and verse 4. The Lord says, I will choose their delusions, speaking of Israel, and will bring their fears upon them. Because when I called, none did answer. When I spake, they did not hear. But they did evil before mine eyes, and chose that in which I delighted not. He'll choose their delusions. You know what? I'm gonna send you like he did in the days of King Ahab, when Ahab wanted to go up against Ramoth Gilead, and he sent that prophet, the lying spirit in the mouth of his prophets, and told him, go up and prosper. And then he got his butt handed to him. The Lord sent him a delusion. He chose his delusion, and bring their fears upon them. I just think about people. I keep thinking about people. But I think about people that I've known that were just full of fears and anxieties about all kinds of stuff. And then they rejected God's counsel and God's word, and it looked like God chose their delusions for them and deluded them to believe things that I would have never thought that they would believe. And it wouldn't surprise me if their fears come upon them, and if their fears overtake them. That's a scary thought, I'll tell you. That is scary. 2 Thessalonians 2, 10 through 12. I'm not going to read that one, but you know that one where it says, they receive not the love of the truth. For this cause God shall send them strong delusion that they should believe a lie. Because they receive not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. Now I'm just going to give you an example of this. I'm going to give you an example of God allowing some headstrong fool that wants to have it his way, just go ahead, have it your way. Now I'm not going to go through all these verses. I'm just going to basically just go through here and make reference to them, because we've been through the story of Balaam before, and that's what we're going to look at here. But the story of Balaam is such a good example of what happened here in Proverbs chapter 1. And you can refer to that series. I think it was like 15 sermons long or something like that. But you remember Balaam. He was greedy of gain. He loved the wages of unrighteousness. That's what it said there in 2 Peter 2 and verse 15. And Balaam, if you remember, talk about a guy that he sounded like a child of God. He said, whatsoever the Lord says, that shall I do. I can't add anything to it or take anything away from it. Basically my paraphrase. Though Balak shall give me his house full of silver and gold, I cannot go beyond the word of the Lord. I mean, it sounded great, right? He sounded like a zealous child of God, prophet of God, and yet he was a child of hell. And Peter tells us that he for him is reserved the mist of darkness forever. He uses him as an example of one of the false prophets that's hellbound. Balaam desired to go with Balak, the king of Moab, in order to curse Israel to be financially rewarded. And you can read about that in Numbers 22. And after receiving the offer, Balaam went to the Lord, hoping to get God's rubber stamp on his plans. He was just hoping that God would say, oh yeah, go ahead and curse my people. You know, like God's going to say that, right? Yeah, go ahead and curse them. But God didn't say that. God said, and I quote, thou shalt not go with them, thou shalt not curse the people, for they are blessed. Sometimes, and there's a few places in the Bible like this, when God really wants to be clear, he's not using 3 or 4 syllable words. He gets very, very simple. Thou shalt not go with them. Right? All 1 syllable words. Just like when he says, thou shalt not do so unto the Lord thy God. You know, pretty much almost all 1 syllable words. Thou shalt not curse the people, for they are blessed. Numbers 22 and verse 12. So after relaying the Lord's message to Balak and receiving a better offer, Balaam rejects the counsel of God. He returns back to God, and he hopes that God has changed his mind. Because, God said, very clearly, do not curse them. Don't go with them. And he goes back to Balaam and says, hey, I can't do it. And Balaam says, hey, I will elevate you to honor. And he's like, well, let me just go ask God again, just to see, maybe he's decided he'll do it now. Kind of like whenever your child comes to you and says, can I do this? And you say, no, you're not doing it. And then he comes back in a few minutes, can I do this? Or better yet, maybe he goes to mom instead of dad or whatever, Right, exactly. That'll put an end to that. Don't you love that after when they ask you 2 or 3 times the same thing? Well, in God's case, God kind of says, okay, Balaam, you want to go? You really want to curse them? Go ahead. But see, if Balaam was paying attention, he'd have remembered, you know what? God actually said don't do it. And now God's telling me, go ahead. And Balaam would have thought, now why did he tell me in such plain language, don't do this? And now, just a little bit later, he says, go ahead, but just say what I tell you to say. That should have been a red flag, because is God a man that he should repent? Does God just change his mind like that, willy-nilly? No, he doesn't.
Balaam he's not a son. He's not one of God's elect, and he doesn't fear God.
Right, and
so
that's.
I suppose that's the reason why he's like.
Exactly. Oh, yeah, exactly. He was eager. I'm sure as soon as God says, "Go ahead, just say what I tell you to say," he probably didn't have to think about that. He didn't say, "Are you sure, Lord? Because you did tell me not to do it just a minute ago." No, he was going to jump right on that. The Lord had already cried at Balaam to turn at his reproof. Or Proverbs 1:23. That's what the Lord had already cried to him. Balaam would none of it. He despised it, just like verses 24 and 25, Proverbs chapter 1. Then the Lord answers a fool according to his folly. Remember Proverbs 26:5. Answer not a fool according to his folly. And then he says, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. He makes Balaam eat the fruit of his own way and be filled with his own devices. Proverbs 1:31. So he tells him what he wants to hear. He says, quote, if the men come to call thee, rise up and go with them, but yet the word which I shall say unto thee, that shalt thou do. Like I said, this was the opposite of what the Lord had told him previously, and this would have spared him all the trouble. Balaam would have been fine. But because Balaam would have none of God's counsel, the Lord gave him what he wanted as a judgment against him, and then opposed him as an enemy. You remember Numbers 22:22, whenever Balaam went along the way on the ass, and the Lord kept putting the angel of God in front of the ass and preventing him and stopping him. And then after several failed attempts to follow his own lust and disobedience to God, Balaam ends up dying in his iniquity by being slain with the sword. Numbers 31 and verse 8. So Balaam is a victim of his own devices, as will be all fools who discard wisdom's cry and are given over to their own way as a judgment against them. As it says in Proverbs 1:32, the turning away of the simple shall slay them. And that's the verse that we'll get to next time we get back to this study.